Welcome to Put Simply, the podcast that puts what's happening in the world simply without compromising on the details. Erdem Koch is my name, Rodney McCune and Ozan Ibrisim are my co-hosts. Gents, wonderful to see you again.
Good to be with you.
Very exciting today.
And of course, we chat on the background of global stock market turmoil, a plunge in stock markets around the world over the last 5 or 6 days since the US President Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on pretty much every single country, which has seen a lot of nervous investors in lots and lots of markets all around the world. We'll go through what that all means, but let's start, Ozan, with Liberation Day, as President Trump put it. He stood in the Rose Garden of the White House with a large cardboard which basically outlined tariffs against every single country. He did say that something like this was coming. Explain to us what he did and in the context of whether you think it was expected or not, and then we'll get on to the ramifications.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, none of this is a surprise. He's been flagging this for a few months, talking about his Liberation Day, what he has labelled incorrectly, I may add, and we'll get to that in a minute, but what he has labelled reciprocal tariffs. Again, no surprise throughout his election campaign. In fact, throughout the last 30 to 40 years, President Trump has had some sort of fetish with tariffs, and that certainly was clear last week on the day, as you mentioned. He stood up in the Rose Garden and declared Independence Day, and the cardboard, I suppose, poster that you're referring to, Adam, had effectively every country, or most countries, of course China being on the top of it, followed by European Union, Vietnam, and it had this odd. It had three columns: the name of the country. The middle column was the tariffs charged to the US. So that was the percentage that they came to through some very, very odd formula, a formula that you would expect a 5-year-old to put together. And again, we'll get to that in a minute. But then on the far right column, effectively had the USA discounted reciprocal tariffs. So let's put a few things simply. Tariffs, as we've discussed already on the show, and I'm sure by now everybody's aware, by themselves or universally not a bad thing. It's just about how they are used. And the Trump administration seems to believe that that tariffs are a great way to punish those countries that the US has had a trade deficit with, which effectively means that the US imports more than they export to a particular country. So China is one of them. Vietnam is another obvious one of those. And effectively has decided that they're going to try and rebalance this by trying to put more tariffs on, or put tariffs on these countries and reduce their deficit. Now, again, let's go back one step. Put simply, if the US has a trade deficit with China or Vietnam, it has less to do with the level of tariffs that China or Vietnam are charging US importers, and more to do with the booming demand of the US consumers, who for the last 15, 20, 25 years have benefited from significantly cheap products that were built in Vietnam and China. For example, Vietnam, you could, I'm sure people have seen by now, many of the Nike runners that people are wearing in the US come from Vietnam, as Nike has a very big manufacturing plant in Vietnam, and there are many, many electronic goods that come from China and other parts of Asia, as well as other textiles. So what President Trump is trying to do is to try and reduce the imports coming in and rely more on exports and try and balance that kind of deficit out. So, which is really, from an economic point of view, extremely stupid. I'm sorry to say, it's really, really dumb, because most rich countries have deficits with other countries where they rely on cheap-made products to feed their consumer demand. This is something that we've seen over the last 20, 25 years. And what's more bizarre and what's more concerning out of all of this is the formula that the Trump administration has used. I flagged it before. It would be something that you would expect a 5-year-old to come up with. Basically, take Vietnam, which is one of the most extreme cases. The administration is claiming that Vietnam is charging the US 90% in tariffs, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. And many people went, okay, that's a bit odd because how do you get to that figure? And, you know, I know Vietnam relatively well, and, I know that on average, Vietnam charges about 15% in tariffs. That's 1.5, certainly not 90. But what they've done is basically they've taken the US goods trade deficit with the country, so in this case, Vietnam, they've divided it by that country's exports to the US and then turned it into a percentage figure. And that percentage figure has come up with 90%. And then they've said, okay, let's divide that. Let's be kind to them, as President Trump has said, and charge them half of what they're charging us. So you can see how problematic this is because Vietnam actually charges about 15%, but President Trump and this administration are effectively conning people and scamming Vietnam as well by saying that they're charging half of what they are being charged and coming up with a figure of 45%, which is 3 times what Vietnam is actually charging them. So it's just a big scam. It's just a massive con job, and I can't believe that we're even having this conversation. Most economists are just, you know, gobsmacked that this is the, from the US, which is supposed to be the most advanced country when it comes to this sort of stuff. This is the type of calculation that you use and formula that you use to come up with just this absurd kind of scheme. I'll let Rodney or yourself, Erdem, maybe talk about some of the outfall from this, but it is just, I don't know what we've been liberated from. I don't know, common sense, economic theory, and just, being, I suppose, smart. That's what we've been liberated from.
Well, the ramifications have obviously been huge. The stock markets around the world have suffered their worst losses, definitely since the pandemic and arguably since the global financial crisis of 2008. So we are seeing real time some very, very nervous investors. But if we look at why this has been done by President Trump, Rodney, there's a lot of talk about this being a negotiating tactic, right? Which is obviously something that a lot of people hope. In that, if he puts this out there, then countries, and we've already seen countries like Taiwan, drop sort of some of their tariffs imposed on the US, make it a little bit easier for the US to do trade with these countries, and that is sort of a win, right? And some of the Trump supporters have already come out and said that it's working. Or that there's also the longer game here, that Trump wants to permanently restructure the global economy and America's place in it. We've seen obviously some talks in the UK saying that this is the end of the current trading world as we know it, potentially the end of globalization, etc. What is the rationale behind all of this? And is there any logic in your view to this whole, we'll deal with the short-term pain, which is obviously the implications on the stock market, plus potentially higher prices in the US and in other countries as well, inflation, maybe a recession, but there is sort of longer term benefits that will come from these actions.
I mean, what you're really asking me to do is to explain the mind of someone who might not be of sound mind. The madman is a dreamer awake, or something like that. I mean, the rationale is something he's very fixated on. I don't believe anymore that this is a tactic, because we've seen the extraction of some domestic policy concessions from Canada and Mexico, and then the continued imposition of tariffs. He's certainly got Mike Pence to be vocal again. I think he call it nuclear Armageddon or something, or I don't know, something like that. Rand Paul, who's been a Trump fanboy, has also been critical. Mitch McConnell, obviously, and there's also various um, investors, Bill Ackman, who he called it economic nuclear winter. That must be what it was. Larry Fink has obviously been critical. So lots of people who are expected to know more than Stormy Daniels about the global economy have been very critical. The accepted implication is costs are going to go up, but concentrated across manufacturing, construction, agriculture, um, service industry, and so on. Investment's going to go down, spending is going to go down, and confidence is going to go down, and we're going to get upturn in inflation, depression in growth, and a 60% prediction of a recession now by JP and Goldman Sachs. So um, he's definitely out to restructure something. I'm just not, well, I suppose he is out to structure how global trade is done, but I'm not sure it'll necessarily end up with a positive. However, there is that tiny possibility that he is really, really, really smart and everyone else is stupid. What's happened in the UK is that Brexiteers who have been quite silent for the past number of years on the economic stupidity that was Brexit have now started to praise the decision to leave Brexit as some great foresight because there's a discrepancy or a divergence between the tariffs being imposed in on the UK and on the wider EU. Imagine getting to the point where you're celebrating 10% hike in some damaging effect on your own manufacturing and export industries or industries that export and manufacture. I mean, honestly, it's really bad. But he may be really smart. And as much as I said Elon Musk would be his Achilles heel and feel like I've been vindicated on that, I will also apologize profusely if it turns out that Donald Trump is much, much smarter than any of us thought.
I mean, anything is entirely possible. There's no doubt about that, and it might well be that he's playing some sort of five-dimensional chess that none of us common people, with common IQ levels and what have you, can kind of decipher. There's no doubt about that. I mean, but uh, it's if you just apply logic, which I think you have to, there's just no way that this thing makes any sense. I mean, if you have this long-term view, and this wouldn't be the first time tariffs have been used. They were used quite commonly in the 70s, 80s for countries as part of their industry policy and to build certain industries. But that's just not possible. I mean, we live in a world where, it's not, there's just absolutely no way in which you can, in a short period of time, suddenly scale up production in your country on all those sorts of things that you need to feed your domestic demand. It's just not, I mean, who's going to invest in that? It's just, I'm looking at X, other social media things, and all these people, like, there's so many abandoned factories and abandoned buildings that can be used to start up factories again, etc. And I'm just, again, maybe I'm not seeing it. Maybe I'm not smart enough to understand how this stuff really works. But in my experience, uh, the building of a factory is the first thing that you need. After that, you need machinery, and then after that, you need somebody to put capital in it, and then somebody to say, okay, you know what, actually, what we're building, people want to buy, or sorry, what we're producing, people want to buy. And then some smart person in the room is going to ask, well, can we get that cheaper anywhere else? Like, or can the consumers get it cheaper anywhere else? Um, these are not, this is not, we're not playing SimCity here. It's not a computer game where you can just build a factory and suddenly start producing widgets or bikes or, whatever, computers. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, is fantasizing about having armies of millions of people building iPhones in the US.
Best way to get off fentanyl, Ozan, build an iPhone. Get off drugs, build an iPhone. I mean, yeah.
I think more people need to be on drugs just to be able to deal with this or understand it. Like it's just madness. It is batshit crazy. And in that sense, I think we're seeing something that's not it's not changing the world order. It is destroying the world order with very little insight or very little glimpse of what's going to realistically replace it. And that's why many people have a lot of problem with what's going on, because there is no plan to build industry in the US. I mean, let's be 100, and people will argue against this, but let's be 100% accurate here, and this is a fact. He is doing this, or the administration is doing this, to raise money. This is one of the reasons, I would say, but to raise money so that they can reduce the deficit and they can give tax cuts to very wealthy billionaires, of many whom are in his cabinet. But this is what this is for. And I cannot see any other way of explaining it. And, some people who are still trying to defend it, and my message to them is give up and just don't go on in media anymore, because you're looking sillier and sillier. Some people are saying that this is a reset. Some people are saying that this is Trump's way of ensuring that he can reduce all of the tariffs, etc. And it may well be, you may get that result at the end of the day, but you know, the means don't justify the ends, because what you're doing is effectively you're killing the economic. Sorry, you're killing the economy. What you're doing is you're giving people very little reason to invest, and all of these things are not going to turn out the way that you want to. And that this is something that I think we just need to be aware of. And what upsets me a lot about it also is it's going to really hurt the poor economies in the world. I mean, we talk about Vietnam, who I think has been very unfairly hit. Vietnam relies on exporting to countries like the US, the EU, etc. It is a manufacturing economy, and if you suddenly follow through with your threats of tax of import of putting a 43% tariff on Vietnam, that country is going to be in dire straits. Now, China, on the other hand, and the EU and others who are bigger economies can stand up and say, well, fine, if you're going to do that, I'm going to do the same thing. In fact, China has said we will retaliate. And then overnight, President Trump has said that he's going to increase tariffs by another 50% if China follows through with its threats to retaliate, which then increases the amount of tariffs, or the full amount of tariffs on China, to over 100%. Where are people going to get their iPhones? I mean, this is just, there have been some projections of iPhones costing almost $9,000, $10,000 under this tariff regime. It's just madness. I don't have any other words for it.
You heard it here first. Go out and buy an iPhone this week, or several, and sell them in 2 months' time.
Or start up an iPhone factory, mate. Apparently, it's really easy. I've got a building for you that you can use. Just jump on there.
I just don't know any potential workers for my factory. The things that I think as well, really, Ozan and Erdem, are relevant is, I mean, there's an agreement that there's going to be pain for a period of time before we arrive at the destination. Everyone's agreed on the fact that there's going to be pain. There's a disagreement on whether the destination itself is going to be economically beneficial to anyone, never mind America, or the US. And then there's no real impression that they have any plan B or ceiling as to how much the pain will be before they decide to stop. They're so focused on arriving at this post-tariff utopia that they have no concept of how much pressure it's going to put on people. And that's the bit that, even if they were right in terms of the destination being beneficial for the US, they've not factored in politically the pain in the meantime. And public opinion still, I mean, there's been these protests, obviously, in recent weeks and or recent days, and it seems to be more organized, and the Democrats seem to be getting more of a voice for opposition, but it's around Musk as much as anything. Um, but I watch Vox Pops on the news from the US. People still don't appreciate that they're going to pick up the cost of the imposition of tariffs as consumers. I mean, Pence called it the biggest post-war US type tax hike, because that's ultimately who's going to be picking up the cost of this, consumers and taxpayers, right? No one, I just don't think people in the US have quite, in the broad sense, got the fact that that's who pays for this, because their president keeps saying foreign governments pay for this. So I think as the pain starts to bite, because we've only had the announcement and the obvious impact on financial markets, etc., what we haven't had is the actual impact on consumers, which is yet to come. And the fact that there is no plan B, the fact there is no ceiling, hell bent on getting to the destination, means this could be a very turbulent few months in America, as these things start to really bite.
I guess here it's worth mentioning the incredible, powerful communication machine that Trump has built, and not just Trump, but the entire MAGA movement. And that is probably why, Rodney, to your point, that people aren't seeing the fact that those who will pick up the costs will be, the average American, the average household. I think there's talks of, $3,000 to $4,000 that this could cost people, and people who are already struggling. I mean, the middle class is notorious in America for not being paid great wages, and obviously dealing with the incredible cost of living pressures that have come since the pandemic, that has been top of mind for many voters indeed. This will affect them. This will affect communities all around the world, to your point, Ozan, the people in Vietnam and across Southeast Asia and Latin America and all the countries that tariffs have been imposed on, even sometimes where tariffs are not, imposed on the US in terms of what is sort of, I guess, applied to them. Politically, how does this play out? Because it's not like this is something that was unexpected. It's not like the backers of Trump are coming out and saying, "Oh, what are you doing now? You've come into the office and you're sort of wreaking havoc." This was incredibly expected. Where do you see the political ramifications of this in the broader context of Trump's vision for America, for what's happening with Doge and Elon Musk, from what's happened in Florida, and perhaps you can take us through that, Ozan, as well. Where does this play out from a political perspective for Trump?
Look, I think as Rodney very correctly pointed out, the real kind of political pain hasn't been felt yet, because effectively the economic pain hasn't been felt, and I think that's going to be the big game changer when, if, and I say if because it's very likely that Trump is going to backpedal, as he has done with many other things where he sees a potential for great political pain. But what I think is likely to happen is you're likely to see an accumulation of various different things. So, inflation is not going down. The stock market means many people's retirement funds are impacted, and many, mum and dad investors who are on the stock market have suddenly lost their wealth. It's going to have significant impact on businesses cutting back jobs. So, we talk about prices going up for consumers, but an economic slowdown, which he's clearly trying to engineer, is going to have serious ramifications for many people, particularly middle class and lower income Americans. So I think when that starts to kick in, and when that pain starts to get felt, is when you're going to start to see a lot of the indicators, such as opinion polls, etc., have shift. And I say the accumulated effect because I think that there are other serious problems that that Trump has, and that is Elon Musk. I think Elon Musk is becoming somewhat of a toxic character, particularly amongst some of the independents, etc. And that, I think, was evidenced by a number of elections that were held in the last couple of weeks. Last week, the Wisconsin Supreme Court election was held. Usually, or typically, this sort of election doesn't get a lot of attention, certainly not a lot of money. And I believe estimates showed that almost $100 million was spent, of which was spent by I think about 21 million was spent by Elon Musk, and effectively it became a bit of a referendum on Elon Musk. Now the non-aligned but Democrat-backed judge in the end won by almost 10 points. And Wisconsin is a very, very, very knife edge purple state. Trump won it by just, I think, under 1 point in November. It is a swing state, and the fact that they were able to the Democrat was able to win, or the Democrat-backed candidate was able to beat the candidate that was very much endorsed by Trump, but also backed heavily by Elon Musk, I think is a very clear sign that Elon Musk and his the way he has behaved and has carried himself is not resonating all that well with the American electorate. Of course, Republicans have sold this or have tried to spin this to say that, when Trump's not on the ticket or when Trump's not on the ballot, Republicans don't come out. And they have a point. I think it's very well proven that Trump has an ability to get people to vote who don't usually vote. So they do have a point there. But I think it's a clear sign that Elon Musk's not popular. And also, if you need another example as to the kind of political pendulum starting to turn against Trump, you don't have to look further than the two elections that were held in Florida, one to replace Matt Gaetz's seat, and the other one was to replace Mike Waltz of Signal fame. And the Democrats made significant ground. They picked up 10 to 15 points. They didn't win those seats in the end, those congressional seats. It was never expected that they would, or very few people expected that they would. But there was significant swings against the Republicans. And I have to say, I think there is more and more reporting of Republicans in Congress showing a great deal of anxiety. The midterms are not that far away. I mean, we're effectively a year out from the campaign for the midterms. 6-7 months out from the campaign for the midterms starting in full force. And if you're a Republican congressman or congresswoman sitting on in a Biden or a Harris one area, and you've managed to hold your congressional seat, you have to be very worried that you're going to lose it. So I think we're going to see some very interesting politics at play. I wouldn't be surprised, if you started to see, I won't say a revolt within the congressional Republican caucus, but certainly less kind of obedient behavior towards the emperor. I think you're going to see many of them start to go, okay, fine, I'm all for Trump, big fanboy or fangirl, but at the end of the day, I'm going to lose my job here, and you're going to start, I'll put it this way: I wouldn't want to be Mark Johnson, the Speaker of the House right now, because he's going to have a very, very difficult job to hold together a lot of those very, very anxious and nervous Congress members who are Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, the political implications will come because the messaging around it, with Trump saying prices are down, oil's down, whatever it happens to be, it's a little bit like when you go to the nurse or the dentist for your first injection and they say it's not going to hurt, and that sort of tempers it until the thing actually happens, and then it's the sort of once bitten, twice shy. And I think that the difficulty for Trump is any painful consequence is a direct result of his decision making that then isn't able to be blamed on the Democrats. It isn't able to be blamed on any predecessor administration. I know he keeps saying that previous administrations have all not done anything and he's fixing the problem, but the benefit that he promises is much further down the line, and there'll be a credibility gap on his ability to deliver that wonderful future whilst he's going through the difficult present. And I do think that it's going to have political implications for him. I think we're also starting to see those types of divisions within the administration anyway. There's some, murmurings around the economic policies, we'll put it that way, around tariffs and so on. But there's also the sacking of a number of people at the National Security Council on the say-so of Laura Loomer's research on the meeting that she had a few days ago, private meeting with the president, which obviously impacts on Waltz. And Signal is still going to come back. Signalgate as an issue that hasn't gone away because the promised investigation hasn't reported. So there's a swirl of difficult stories to manage, and the one which might really puncture the credibility of Trump as being the guy on our side is going to be the economic impact in the short term of this decision making.
Well, that and indeed, of course, his view on foreign policy matters. He did host overnight, at the time of this recording, Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu in the Oval Office, where multiple things were said. One of the most interesting ones was the confirmation that the US and Iran will hold direct talks over a possible nuclear deal, which was also confirmed by Iran's foreign minister, who said that the talks would be indirect but could be as much as an opportunity as much as a test. Ozan, what does a nuclear deal look like between the US and Iran, and what are the ramifications of this for both countries and indeed the world?
Well, I guess it looks a little bit like the nuclear deal that Trump cancelled that was brought in place by Obama. I can't imagine it looking very different to that. But yes, look, it's a very interesting development. I think the Israelis are very happy that they've been able to get this out of Trump. It's not a surprise, despite the fact that since 1979, the Iranian Revolution, I believe there's been only a handful of times that the US has directly been in conversations with the Iranian regime. But it's not a surprise. I mean, Trump in his first term went over and hung out with Rocket Man, the dictator of North Korea. So he's again prepared to do this sort of stuff. It's very much in line with his politics of I'm a fixer. I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to them and I'm going to directly deal with this, etc. But it much like everything else that he's tried to do, he's going to very quickly find out that it's not a very easy task. Much like the tariffs, much like trying to change the makeup of the government and what have you with his little dodge antics, he is going to find out that this is not an easy task. So effectively, to put simply or to give some background, the Obama administration back in the early 2010s struck a deal with Iran, which was known as the Iran nuclear deal, and effectively gave several concessions to Iran to ensure that that Iran was transparent about its nuclear program, which it claims is obviously for civilian purposes, but I think most of the world, including Israel, probably don't believe that. And when Trump came in, he effectively cancelled it and broke the deal. Again, it was apparently a very, very bad deal. But obviously, what it's now meant is that there's been no deal in place. And when I say it was a very bad deal, that was what the Republican mantra at the time, and Trump, his mantra was. And yes, it wasn't a perfect deal, but it was a deal, and it was effectively an environment, or we had a scenario where there was some transparency, and there were people sitting around the table having eyes on what Iran was doing. Now, since he pulled that deal off the table. For the last 6-7 years, there hasn't been any transparency, and many commentators and people who know a lot more about this than I do are very worried that Iran is not too far away from being a nuclear power. And so obviously that is the main game for Israel. From their point of view, that's an existential threat. So they've been able to convince Trump to try and have at least initial conversations to start talking about a new deal. But I don't think the Iranians are going to strike a deal that's worse than the deal that they struck with Obama. I think the world has changed. They've changed. Their priorities have changed, and most importantly, they're very, very close. They're much closer than they were when they last struck a deal. Trump, the art of the deal man, he's going to find it difficult to strike a very good deal without giving away a lot of concessions. And then I feel that we're going to be back to where we started off, with a deal that looks very similar to the nuclear deal that Obama struck, and the one that Trump was very critical of, in fact, to the point where he pulled out of it. So, yeah, complete waste of 6-7 years, if you ask me. It wasn't a perfect deal, but hopefully, again, if it's a positive thing that they can come up with and come up with some structure by which they can, strike a deal, perfect. But I don't think it's going to be that easy.
I mean, this is where the deal maker myth is lanced in some way, or the contrast between deal making and mediation is highlighted, because this requires compromise, mediation, collaborative problem solving, all things that are completely alien to Trump. And if we look at his success record on bridging divides to find compromises, he hasn't done a great job between Ukraine and Russia, let's be honest. The Gaza Hamas-Israel ceasefire didn't really sustain, and neither did his great peace discussions with North Korea really gain any momentum or actually secure a proper agreement. It's all fluff, and if people don't agree, then he walks away and moves on to the next shiny object. And I fear that his ability to reach a serious and impactful agreement with Iran on the nuclear issue is probably quite limited, and not least because, as you say, Ozan, they are further down the road to the nuclear destination than they were a number of years ago when he dispensed with the Obama agreement. But I think when it comes to these types of situations, he likes to pick a side and then drive that side's agenda, which isn't what mediation is when you need parties to compromise and agree. And I just don't think he has the mindset, the skill set, or just potentially the intention to ever try and find those types of solutions, because again, the mediator tends to be less visible when the problem's solved, and he wants to be the most visible, and therefore it's not really his nature, in my view. So I as much as these talks will happen, whether they're direct or indirect, with the Omanis operating as some sort of whisperer, I'm not sure that he can really secure agreement, because his expectations are often so widely divorced from that of others that it just becomes, a failed exercise.
And I think you raise a very good point. I mean, he has right now so much on his agenda, and I suspect he's going to have to delegate this. And I'm taking bets on who becomes the special envoy to lead up this, or to head up these dialogues. I've had a few people bet on Hulk Hogan, and then a few others. And then we've got Kid Rock as one of the candidates. So, so it's going to be interesting. Jokes aside, you're absolutely right. I mean, he's going to get the headlines. He's going to do something that's historic, and then he's going to move on, because he doesn't have the bandwidth at the best of times to deal with anything this complex. but right now he's dealing with a global economic meltdown. A bunch of, major countries retaliating against him, not calling his bluff. He's got a fair bit on his plate. So, um, all the power to Hulk Hogan, I say.
So the one that well, I hope it isn't Hulk Hogan. Just he doesn't speak Farsi as far as I'm aware for a start. But the one exception, of course, is the Abraham Accords. But in relation to that, the parties to that agreement were all on basically the same page in advance. All he did was throw the party and invite them. He didn't have to manage people into new space. He just had to provide a platform for them to reach an agreement that they were probably already going to reach, and just
Yeah.
needed the venue.
And I mean, also, one would argue that, the whole Abraham Accords, again, looks great on paper, but, neglected to take in the views of Hamas and others, which, you could argue, or as some have, that, caused much of the kind of, I suppose, anxiety and a lot of the conflict and tension that we have now, because it pretty much threatened to lock out Hamas, and then, of course, Iran by that point was supporting Hamas, locking out Iran, etc. Yeah, I mean, you came to a deal, but what was the consequences? You know what I mean?
Well, it was a historic deal between the Gulf Arabs and Israel, which was significant in itself, and it laid the ground for better cooperation or future cooperation, not better, future cooperation with the Saudis and the Israelis. And what Iran did after that was to seek to torpedo it because they were outside the deal, but they didn't want to be part of a deal, so they weren't excluded. They chose to be excluded and then got annoyed that everyone else had a good time. And I think I'm going back to my party analogy for that. So yeah, I take your point, but I also think they weren't at the right point in their cycle to reach some sort of agreement. I'm not sure they are now, and I'm not sure that this US administration's the one who's going to help um move that forward. Although the one little ray of hope, I suppose, is your assessment that he's too busy to involve himself in it and he might have to delegate. So if it's not him and it's not Hulk Hogan, you just never know.
Speaking of ways forward and expectations, let's have a look at the latest in France. And someone who's been hit hard by a court ruling is the leader of the far-right National Rally, Marine Le Pen, who has been issued a court ruling which basically found her guilty of helping to embezzle almost 3 million of EU funds between 2004 and 2016 for use by her party, which has resulted in the banning of her running for 5 years. Of course, the next presidential elections, which she wanted to run in, is going to be held in 2027. She's called this a witch hunt. Rodney, is that a view you subscribe to?
No, but I think she might be justified in saying that it's not unique um, within broader politics where parties seek to fund themselves through public money that's allocated for staffing and not use the staffing for the purpose that the funding was allocated. I mean that because that's really the nub of what has been where this is all sort of centered on. But it seems to have been on a pretty industrial scale with much larger numbers, perhaps, than others may have been involved in. So I'm not suggesting in any way that the judicial system was politically motivated. It may help her politically as it did to Donald Trump. But if she is excluded, it's a real test for how much of the far right in France is a cult of Le Pen, and whether they could really move that support to another candidate with the same likely success. No different than the Reform Party and Farage in the UK. You remove Farage from the table, and it would be a lot more difficult for the Reform Party to find that type of he's on our side, a little bit like Trump, he's on our side character to lead it, because The others are somewhat lacking. One who's elected now, but formerly was a leader with very little impact. And I do wonder whether the same will happen for Le Pen's group, the National Rally. So it remains to be seen. I suspect it won't be overturned. I suspect that she will be excluded, and that that makes for quite an interesting um, uh, election in France in the future, and whatever, I don't know. Um, I mean, I know they're saying they're going to appeal, but appealing a legal decision within a time frame to meet elections, um, and whenever it is 2027, might be a bit of a problem, because these things often take a lot longer than maybe one would hope when it comes to these types of legal appeal processes. So I think she's probably excluded. I can't see that it'll be overturned. And it'll be a good test politically of what they have in the pipeline for other potential candidates when it comes to the election. So no sympathy for Le Pen, which I'm sure you're not greatly surprised by.
Look, I think we we live in a dangerous time, I think, because when something happens and the justice process sees its course, and then we have an outcome, etc. The first thing that people are doing is trying to use it for political purposes, and I think this is very dangerous. These terms being thrown around, lawfare, etc., are really undermining the kind of the process, and we saw this in the US. We have a president who's been found guilty on 34 charges. He's a felon, and this became a political issue, and it's so it whether this gets overturned or not. I just hope that the process goes through, but we can't be in a political environment where we are afraid of seeing the justice system, uh, you know, deal with and treat things that are illegal, because we're worried about what the political outcome will be, and what and how that will impact them politically. And on conversely, we every time a justice system comes up with a finding, we can't be throwing these sorts of accusations that this is all political. Like, I think this is very dangerous for a democracy, any democracy, but one like France, and of course the US as well, because it really does muddy the waters when it comes to law and order. And I think uh, this is something that we've really got to. I hope that we stop seeing, but I don't think so, because Viktor Orban's come out and basically declared a solidarity movement. Trump has labelled this a witch hunt. The kind of far right populist leaders and movement are all rallying around Marine Le Pen, and talking about how this is a lawfare um, against free speech. It's backed by European leftists. I'm surprised they haven't thrown Biden in there as one of the instigators. I'm sure it'll soon Soros will get the blame for being behind it. This stuff's got to stop. This is the justice system. The processes should be allowed to run their course. And she should have the right to appeal it. If she appeals it and gets found that she's innocent, or she hasn't embezzled those funds, or broken any laws, so be it. That's great. But if the decision holds, I fear that we're going to see a massive rallying around her, and she's going to become a huge martyr. And for the next 2 years, we're going to be hearing about how the left is trying to use lawfare against the right, and this is getting old and very dangerous.
Yeah, look, when it's trivial, they tend to overlook it, right, in order to protect democracy and not put political parties in direct conflict with the judicial system because it politicizes the justice system and it's open to these allegations of persecution and so on. But the sums involved were too big to ignore in relation to this, and it's not that uncommon in France for them to go to go and and have cases against
Exactly.
political figures.
Exactly.
So of everywhere in Europe that it doesn't look that odd, it's France, to be honest. So I think it's probably going to be accepted in France as something which has a whiff of truth, and it's going to adversely impact electorally, not just because of the loss of the high-profile candidate, but anywhere where there's a political party where there's any reasonable view that they've been involved in the misuse of public funds, why would you put them in charge of public funds as an electorate? I mean, it's really
Exactly.
that simple.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
yeah,
But I'm just so sick of uh, people talking about just dismissing stuff that leaders do, as as the justice system being weaponized against them. No, I mean, if a leader has done something wrong or a political figure has done something wrong, they've embezzled funds or whatever, they've broken the law, they should, they shouldn't be above the law. But this is how this is the situation we find ourselves, whereby people getting criminally charged, going through a process and being convicted and having findings against them, suddenly that becomes a political attack on them. Well, no, if you've done something wrong, it doesn't matter who you are, you know the laws should be respected.
no, and she stands in good company. Fillon was had a few issues. Chirac, Sarkozy,
Yeah.
it doesn't feel as
Yeah.
if it's that bad in terms of French politics. In fact, the one who leaves office and manages to avoid a prosecution afterwards, people are like, were they not trying hard enough? Oh, go on.
That's right.
Never a dull
Exactly.
moment. Gents, thank you so much for your time on Put Simply this week. See you next.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And that's been this week's episode of Put Simply. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn at Oroka Group to stay up to date with all the latest episodes and news. Feel free to leave a comment and suggestions on what you'd like to see featured on the podcast as well. Until next time, I'm Erdem Koch. Thanks for listening.